Yaku, if that is who he is, seems to be explaining something about the book to the ladies of his court. So here we have really a kind of ambiguous or multi-layered depiction involving books, involving rulers, and involving this very special manuscript of the Khansa of Nizami. Now, if we had better images or more of them, you could see also that the landscape is quite delightful. There are all kinds of creatures living in it. There are people hunting, there are birds flying. It is a kind of little universe, sort of a kind of world of hills and verdant foliage and flowers. It's a sort of paradisiac setting in which the illustration is situated. Now, this is one of the pictures added in the Safavid period, and it's a very early Safavid picture in which the attendants of, this is again a story from Nizami, but you can see some of the attendants are wearing their Kizilbash headgear without any turban around it. You can see that is on the top and inside, and this is a shape of the turban, and the cap under the turban, which we associate with the very first years of Safavid rule. So this is the very end of the manuscript's sort of trajectory, but still very high quality painting, lovely colors, and really altogether a splendid presentation of Nizami's stories. Now, those of you who were here last time and the time before know that one of the people who figures prominently in the history of the book in Iraq and Iran is a gentleman here, Badadi Ruglu, the ruler of Mosul in the early 13th century. And some people have singled him out as the person who really launched the idea of royal libraries containing books which depict the owner and ruler of whatever area. So his portraits, there are 5 surviving volumes in this enormous set of Arabic poetry and music, which Kitab al-Aghani, and they're scattered around the world, and so I'm not going to tell you which page is where, but so some of them they're quite princely, but not particularly. There's the ruler with his gulams, the ruler hunting. There's another one, which I think is in Cairo, in which where the ruler is cavorting in a garden with his ladies. But there is also these two, which are more regal, I think, in their kind of presentation. The one on the right in Istanbul, the one on the left in Cairo, and we see the kind of the symbols of rule of the Turkish groups, with the ruler with the furry hat, the bow and arrow, seated frontally with his arms around him, and on the left a more kind of Iranized idea of a ruler, conferring with his officials, one of whom is obviously a scribe or has some kind of documents, and then there is the sort of the minister of the court and the head of the military wing. So this is something which is a more royal activity, and it may be, in fact, that Badrin Mulu should be credited with the idea of royal portraiture in literary manuscripts. But it doesn't seem to have really sparked much of a tradition, and this manuscript really is isolated. Whereas, if we turn to the next candidate on the list for the person who really launched this idea, we have, I think, a better chance of finding it, getting it stabilized in such a way that it really becomes a working, living idea. And this person we see here was an individual who was clearly born at the wrong time. His name was Ahmad Jalair, and his misfortune was to be Timur's contemporary. It was very difficult to be Timur's contemporary, especially if you had something that Timur wanted. And Ahmad Jalayir, in fact, did have that because he inherited from his father the city of Baghdad and its surrounding areas as his dominion. And of course, Timur had his eyes on Baghdad, and so Ahmad Jalayir spent most of his adult life running away from Timur in one way or another. Now, somehow, in the midst of all this, he found time to commission some books. And he became quite a well-known bibliophile. Here we see a manuscript in the British Library made for him. And this, is, of course, is a text which resembles Nizami, but it's not Nizami. It's another poet, Khwaja Kirmani, who wrote similar kinds of texts about similar kinds of topics. And so we have the kind of archetypal ruler picture of the ruler showing pity on an old woman, which is one of those stories which kind of runs through the literature about kings in Iran. And so here we have this person who might, in some capacity, be considered a portrait of Ahmad Jalayir, with this woman, beseeching woman, in front of him. Usually they're complaining about some rapacious official who has done something really dreadful. So that's a sort of canonical subject. Now the other subject, which is perhaps the most the part of the manuscript which got the most attention, is one of our enthronement scenes with a royal couple of a male and female side by side, and the female attendants to the left, the male attendants to the right. So this is obviously a picture which harks back to the Mongol enthronement scenes, but is now transposed into a literary framework. And the third picture, which is really also quite fascinating in this manuscript, and there are more, but these are the three I thought were really particularly interesting. We see the ruler enthroned under an arch, and he is consulting with his vizier. He represents one of the caliphs in this story, and so the arch has angels on the side and a moon in the middle. Now, this, all three of these pictures had a kind of impact, and it were imitated and absorbed into the pictorial vocabulary used in other manuscripts. So, for instance, we see other copies of this story, of the kind of the ruler, the old taking pity on the old woman. And Ahmad Jalayir's example is much more courtly in the sense that he's not just by himself, he has a whole retinue of foot soldiers, there's another horse, there's a kind of royal procession, not just the individual. So it goes beyond what the story requires to kind of give us an ambiance for the story, which definitely has a princely flavor. Now, this is the picture which really sparked, or the kind of picture which sparked the widest range of emulation. Now, just to give you a sense, this is, of course, its ancestor, as it were, the Mongol throne portraits, which belong to Mongol histories. And there are a whole series of these pages that survive, that come directly, or that were intended to be in a copy of probably Rashid ad-Din's Chronicle. For some reason, the right side, which is the part with the throne, is more often surviving than the left, although we do have occasionally a copy of the page on the left. Now, these are just surviving as pictures. They aren't in books. They're just sort of model pictures which were kept in albums and were used as models for paintings. And they also, they had a kind of effect on the composition of pictures for narrative stories, although usually the pages focus on the right-hand half of this double page, where we have the ruler and his consort and their intimate associates. So it goes on. You can follow this kind of picture through 15th century manuscripts. On the right, this is a Nizami manuscript, where again we see the ruler, the consort, the female courtiers. On the left, really a half of a double picture, which is just isolated in that fashion and used in a manuscript in a totally unrelated setting. So Ahmad Jalayir's, the compositions in Ahmad Jalayir's manuscript, several of them had an interesting lifespan. This one I was particularly intrigued by because because of the architectural setting, which is not rendered in very much in 3 dimensions, but if you can kind of imagine the arch as being the front of the vault into which the ruler sits, I think you'll get a sense that a space was at least implied. Now, in this case, I think we could go back to the sense of who Ahmad Jalayir was and where he had his rule. This was after the end of the Mongol Empire. The region of Iran sort of devolved into a series of states, shifting boundaries and varying sizes and strengths. But the Jalayirids, who were Mongols by birth, managed to hang on to Baghdad, and part of this is their sort of terrain. Now, and also Tabriz. So they had really kind of the key cities, but they wanted more. Each of these sub-rulers had, many of the sub-rulers had the ambition of reconstituting the entire Mongol state, so they were constantly feuding with each other internally and fighting each other externally. It was a very unstable situation. But anyway, Ahmad Jalayir, in his, I think that the painting that we saw is actually a representation of a particular place. I think that the painting with the arch and the angels, or the sort of winged figures, and the sun at the apex, is copied or inspired by Takibistan, a Sasanian rock-cut monument, which is near between Kermanshah and Hamadan, not actually in the territory that the Jalayirids in fact controlled, but probably territory to which they aspired. So that if you put them side by side, the scale is of course off. I just fitted them together. I think you can get the idea that conceivably this painting, although extremely flat and stylized, was intended to recall a particular physical place. So in the midst of being very stylized, being sort of having double meanings of a ruler and a hero, there could even be more specific messages delivered by a picture which had something particular to do with a situation at a specific time. So in other words, there is a kind of there can be at times a kind of specificity in Persian painting, which is you don't expect because it is so kind of abstractly stylized. But I think in the case here, at least there's a possibility that this was what the painter intended. Now, I mentioned Timur, and of course he looms large in the history of Near Eastern manuscripts, because the Timur dynasty emerged as one of the leading groups of patrons and they controlled Iran and parts of Iran and parts of Central Asia throughout the 15th century. Now, although other parts of it they lost to rivals, so it was a very complicated political scenario. But here at least you get the idea of where it all started with Timur, who again had grand ambitions to reconstitute a major state that was larger than Iran, although he did not really quite succeed. Now, we had Timur before. Now, among the Timurids, the person who was remembered in the literary record as one of the leading patrons of the book is one of his grandsons by the name of Soucek Nov. And we have several manuscripts that were made for Soucek that are documented to have been made for him. This one is the Shahnameh manuscript in Tehran. And he was very interested in the Shahnameh, and he at least encouraged a kind of re-edition of the text. He wasn't himself, I think, really capable of doing the editing himself, but he sort of encouraged the collection and study of Shahnameh manuscript. So this is his sort of master copy of the redone Shahnameh, which is a new preface and so forth, that was produced at least at his court. Now, Soucek Nov, you never will know what he really looked like, but the pictures of him are quite consistent. Here you see a little closer detail. You have kind of a round-faced person with a sort of tiny mustache. Not extremely distinctive, admittedly, but still, it is not exactly the same face as everybody else. There is a sort of sense of him, at least there was an idea of making him distinct. And if you take that, you can see other manuscripts made for him. This is one in Italy, which are not the Shahnameh. It's a book, an anthology of poetry and verse. Not exactly the identical face, but close enough so that one could imagine that a portrayal of him was intended. Now, he was not the only Timurid to introduce himself into the manuscripts that he owned. And a famous example, which has been recently in this country, was the manuscript made for another of his generation, of Soucek's generation of Timurids, Muhammad Juki, and in other Shahnameh. And in the Muhammad Juki Shahnameh, we have some pictures where Muhammad Juki's name is entered into the picture, not as a protagonist exactly, but here is the battle of Rustam and Afrasiyab, and on the banner, which is on the side of Rustam, so this is Rustam's side, on the banner which is on his side of the picture, we see this great unfurling silk banner with a Chinese dragon on it, and the name of Muhammad Juki across the top. So there are 2 or 3 pictures in this manuscript where Muhammad Juki's name is introduced into the painting in such a way that in a sense he becomes a part of the composition. Now here we have him really clearly identified, at least visually identified, with Rustam, who was not royal, but of course a hero of great consequence. Now in manuscript where Muhammad Juki's name is introduced into the painting in such a way that in a sense he becomes a part of the composition. Now here we have him really clearly identified, at least visually identified, with Rustam, who was not royal, but of course a hero of great consequence. Now in another of the famous episodes in the Shahnameh, which those of you reading Persian literature with Professor Karimi Hakak have probably already encountered, is the story of Rustam and Tahmineh and their union, from which comes Sohrab. And the painters were one of the very common things to illustrate in the Shahnameh was the moment at which Tahmineh appears unannounced and uninvited, but still welcome, in Rustam's bedchamber. So you see her now coming through the door, and Rustam sort of quite looking up from his bed at this apparition. Now, this picture, this picture is this is the kind of normal way that this subject is depicted, but there are some more unusual versions of it. And I show you here again. I'm sorry that you won't be able to see this very well, but this is a page in the Fogg Museum, or Harvard Museum of Fine Arts, as they call it, which is the same subject,
we see Tahmineh. It's a sort of opposite configuration. Tahmineh is coming through the door on the left rather than the right. She has a servant who's guiding her with a candle. The curtain has been lifted up. Rustam is here sort of watching all of this. His accoutrements are up there. And the part that you really would be nice for you to be able to see, but I realize you cannot, is that in this section of the architecture, right along here and over along here, there is a continuous band of writing, which is the titulature of one of the Timurids. It's one of Baysungur's sons. So it's, I forget whether it's Allah Adawla. So anyway, there is this, in this capacity, it is not exactly Allah Adawla identified as Rustam, but Allah Adawla's name introduced into this courtly depiction of the encounter of Tahmineh and Rustam. So that is another way that the patron can be sort of introduced surreptitiously into the painting, is to have his titles on an object, his titles on a building, so that he, in a sense, becomes associated with the event, and conceivably, again, also, in some level, associated with Rustam. And now, so this was the kind of thing that one can find among the Timurids. One can find actual portraiture. One can find sort of indirect references on objects or architecture which draw in or equate or integrate a patron with a painting. And so these two approaches continue to be used by other dynasties and also during the later 15th century. Now, one of the things which sort of intrigued me about this idea of sort of double representations of narrative and portraiture kind of in a kind of sort of symbiosis is this particular painting, which is the painting that really sparked, made people think about this question. You know, even a couple generations ago, when Basil Robinson suggested that this depiction that this painting from a manuscript that belonged to Iskandar Sultan, another of Timur's grandsons, was in fact a depiction of Iskandar in the guise of Iskandar visiting a hermit. So the story, again, from Nizami of Iskandar seeking out a hermit to ask him questions to gain knowledge and so forth. Kind of, again, a kind of topos of stories about rulers, is wearing full regalia. He has a crown, he has an elegant robe with embroidery and fur collar. He is led by a servant with a candle. This is a kind of royal procession proceeding to the hermit's cell, where Iskandar will ask the hermit questions to enable him to become a better ruler. And at the moment when this manuscript was being produced for Iskandar Sultan in the city of Shiraz, he was actually in rebellion against Shah Rukh, his overlord. So I began to think, well, maybe also, not only do you have royal portraits in manuscripts in the guise of literary presentations, but that this kind of portraiture could also be something associated with periods of rebellion in which the rebel seeks to kind of legitimize himself through this literary association. Now, that may be going too far. But in the case of Iskandar, the timing of the manuscript, the timing of his rebellion are coincident. And there is another case of Pir Budak Karakoyunlu, who had a manuscript made for himself in Baghdad, in which he is depicted regally enthroned, again as a character, as characters in the Shahnameh, as a ruler who is issuing judicious decrees, and who has a kind of very wise-looking vizier at his side, and a second picture of a ruler. Now, and this is really, I think, the giveaway. This is a very unusual kind of subject for the Shahnameh. It's Ardashir enthroned at Baghdad, which is a very obscure incident in the Shahnameh, but the obvious parallel with Pir Budak's life is, I think, why it is here. So there's a kind of a surrogate portraiture which not only depicts someone, but is kind of, in a measure, intended to bolster the legitimacy and the coincidence of this with periods of personal rebellion, I thought was quite interesting. Now, so this was the kind of thing that one can find among the tumors. One can find actual portraiture. One can find sort of indirect references on objects or architecture which draw in or equate or integrate a patron with a painting. And so these two approaches continue to be used by other dynasties and also during the later 15th century. Now, one of the things which sort of intrigued me about this idea of sort of double representations of narrative and portraiture kind of in a kind of sort of symbiosis is this particular painting, which is the painting that really sparked, made people think about this question. You know, even a couple generations ago, when Basil Robinson suggested that this depiction that this painting from a manuscript that belonged to Iskandar Sultan, another of Timur's grandsons, was in fact a depiction of Iskandar in the guise of Iskandar visiting a hermit. So the story, again, from Nizamiya of Iskandar seeking out a hermit to ask him questions, to gain knowledge, and so forth. Kind of topos of stories about rulers. It is wearing full regalia. He has a crown, he has an elegant robe with embroidery and fur collar. He is led by a servant with a candle. This is a kind of royal procession proceeding to the hermit's cell, where Iskandar will ask the hermit questions to enable him to become a better ruler. And at the moment when this manuscript was being produced for Iskandar Sultan in the city of Shiraz, he was actually in rebellion against Shah Rukh, his overlord. So I began to think, well, maybe also, not only do you have royal portraits in manuscripts in the guise of literary presentations, but that this kind of portraiture could also be something associated with periods of rebellion in which the rebel seeks to kind of legitimize himself through this literary association. Now, that may be going too far, but in the case of Iskandar, the timing of the manuscript, the timing of his rebellion are coincident. And there is another case of Pir Budak Karakoyunlu, who had a manuscript made for himself in Baghdad, in which he is depicted regally enthroned, again as a character, as characters in the Shahnameh, as a ruler who is issuing judicious decrees, and who has a kind of very wise-looking vizier at his side, and a second picture of a ruler. Now, and this is really, I think, the giveaway. This is a very unusual kind of subject for the Shahnameh. It's Ardashir enthroned at Baghdad, which is a very obscure incident in the Shahnameh, but the obvious parallel with Pir Budak's life
is, I think, why it is here. So there's a kind of a surrogate portraiture which not only depicts someone, but is kind of, in a measure, intended to bolster the legitimacy and the coincidence of this with periods of personal rebellion, I thought was quite interesting. Now, the Safavids also continued, of course, to be depicted in this kind of subtle and indirect way. And we have the famous case of Shah Tahmas's brother, Sam Mirza, in this magnificent picture, which actually illustrates one of the ghazals of Hafez. So it is an illustration to a text on some level, but it clearly is also a portrait of a Safavid prince with all of his retinue and in this very splendid setting. Again, Sam Mirza was not actually in revolt, but there were certainly tensions between him and his brother Shah Tahmasp, and this picture is a kind of, at least a bolstering of Sam Mirza's prestige in a pictorial capacity. And of course it was executed by one of the finest Safavid painters, who has left us a signature on the throne. You probably can't see it, the signature is right down here. Signature also for Muhammad. It's very small, but sort of in the textile pattern on the throne. And I love the top of this picture, where it's a celebration of the arrival of Eid, and we have these lovely gentlemen on the roof praying, having just sighted the new moon, which will unleash the celebrations of Eid. And we have also, along the architecture, verses connected with the picture and with the incident. So these are stylized portraiture, and portraiture in the context of literature, but portraiture which seems to me at least to have had at least a certain level of political reality and to have sort of been a kind of expression of a point of view of the patron that was more direct than just him in the guise of a literary hero. Now, as the patronage of manuscripts could have continued through the 15th and into the 16th century, the number of people participating in this enterprise increased. And so here we have a manuscript in the Metropolitan Museum where we have a person enthroned who was, I think, a governor, perhaps, of Herat, which was kind of on the margins of the Safavid state, but was, episodically rescued from the Uzbeks. And in front, we have a whole assortment of people, several of whom could probably be identified if we can decide exactly who this royal or governor figure is. But the person who has interested me about this, the person who's attracted my attention, is the gentleman right in the middle here. Oh, he's not, we have all these very splendidly dressed Safavid courtiers, and perhaps again, with some effort, their identities could be constructed or resurrected. But this person, I think, is doing something very particular. He has a ring on his hand, and the young man is putting some kind of substance on the ring, I suppose ink, with which then this person is going to impress the ring on the document he holds in his hand. So this is a particular kind of Safavid court official connected with the preparation and sort of legitimation of documents, who is kind of inserted in
reason for the existence of the pictures in the first place. So it is this, I think, this kind of indirect, layered approach to representation, in sort of weaving together events from the literary tradition with a kind of a level of experience of the reality surrounding the manuscript's production, that this is one of the really distinctive features of the Iranian manuscript tradition. Thank you. So I realize I have a few more pictures if you want some more. Would you like some more pictures? Would you like some more Tahmasp? I don't know. There's always, it's hard to get too much of Tahmasp, I do agree. Actually, now I think that this idea that I'm proposing, that the pictures have a kind of dual message, or they can have, in certain circumstances, multiple messages, one relating directly to the text, another relating to something more in the environment. I think that the Nizami of Shah Tahmasp is one of the manuscripts where these kind of elements are kept into a really nice balance, so that neither one nor the other completely dominate, so that the sort of royal and personal dimension is integrated so successfully in the composition that it doesn't really hit you in the face. In some cases, I think the things that are added are sort of so kind of curious that you notice them, and you don't really see it as an illustration. But I think this is one of these wonderfully sort of integrated pictures with some elements undoubtedly of personal reference, probably certain individuals, if one knew the Safavid court, one could identify. But overall, it reads very well as an event, as a hunt of the type that is such a sort of main feature of Persian manuscript illustration. And here's an example of the kind of place you are never going to find a ruler depicted. This is a scene where, someone's portrait, I think. This is a scene of a ruler who's riding through the countryside with his vizier, and he sees a building that's falling apart, and he hears the crows or the owls in the building say, well, if this ruler keeps on the way he's going, we're going to have plenty of places to build our nests because he's ruining it. And so this is not the kind of composition in which you would expect to have a royal visage, and we do not. There's some kind of rather unprepossessing person. Whereas here, again, a subject that is royal in context, it is conceivable that one is looking here at Bahram and a ruler like Shah Tahmasp together. So I thank you again. So if people have questions that they have on their mind, yes, I see a hand.
I'm curious, you've shown one image of an illustration which is taken from presumably a divan of Hafiz. Most of the images you've shown today are related to epic poems.
Yes.
But I'm wondering if there are more examples of the kind of these images with collections of shorter poems. If that's something that's also seen.
It could be. The illustration of the long epics was a very well-established idea, and so we have many copies of those. I think for some of these other shorter, more unusual texts, it would be a case of finding one. I don't see there's anything impossible about it. It's just that the others are so much more, they're so much more numerous that it's easy to identify, they come to hand very easily. But the idea, if I'm correct that there is such a kind of
combination or conflation or sort of continuum between the text and the picture and the patron, I don't see why it couldn't be almost any text. It's just you have to find the example and you know, find it out. I mean, I think the principle should be possible. It's just that the Nizami and the Shahnameh are so commonly reproduced and illustrated that they're easy to find. And actually, I think Nizami is, curiously enough, quite a popular choice. And I'm looking forward to getting a good look at the Tamas Shahnameh, which has been published very recently by the Metropolitan Museum with every single picture in color. And it's always been extremely difficult to have any idea about that manuscript since it was dismembered before it was published, or only published in sort of sepia before it was dismembered. And so I'm curious whether going through that, there will be things that kind of stand out as something interesting that might have some of these kind of multiple meanings. But that is now finally available for people to have a look at. And of course, the pictures themselves are all around the world, so the book is the only way to approach it in any only practical way. Yes.
I wonder if you can say something about the conventions regarding the depiction of women, from, say, either comparatively between Timurid and Safavi, or, and I'm especially interested in the context in which they might be depicted in printing narratives, and the manner in which they're depicted.
I mean, I think one sees in the pictures the reality of the social life, which was quite separated. And women occur only in certain kinds of settings, or only certain kinds of women. And certain kinds of women are, for example, here, you have a slave girl in the picture. Slave girls would come most anywhere. But when you have a court with women in it, it's a subject which involves women. You very rarely see women and men depicted together in a social setting, and to my knowledge. So I think this reflects probably, the way it was happening. Now, the sort of Mongol throne picture type is unusual in that respect, because it is a reflection of Mongol court protocol, in which the man and woman were side by side on the throne. There were lots of women in attendance, and this composition and probably this habit fades away as one goes through the 15th century, and by the Safavid period, I don't think you really see that anymore. There is probably a level of reality in the depiction of social settings, which has some correspondence to the way social life was carried out. So that a scene with women would be a court scene of an intimate character, where the ruler would be with his consort and his concubines and so forth. Or it would be a scene with all women, which you have some of. You have women in topics that involve only women, but you would not expect to find them sort of intermingled in crowds. I mean, for instance, I was just seeing this here, a court setting. This is a Safavid court setting. The women are up here, looking out the window, but I don't think there's any women on the ground level. And this would be really quite normal for a picture. And I mean, other people can comment whether it was normal for Safavid court life. I really can't speak to that question, but it's certainly overall in the Middle East a kind of social procedure that is really common. Yes?
I was interested in the relation between the Ja'alir manuscript and Taki Bustan, and I'm wondering, like you were showing the Ottoman and Mughal citation of architecture, do we see that at all in other places in the Iranian
Do you see other kinds of places
Yes,
depicted? Is that what you're asking me?
Specific art.
Other specific places, well, it's hard to, it's hard to recognize places. I mean, there may be places depicted which are specific, but unless there's something visually unusual about them, it's kind of hard to tell. Unless the subject is somehow, you know, leading you in that direction. I mean, I was curious. I mean, and when I was looking at the July painting of the ruler with the arch over his head, I thought, well, this should be Tessiphon, which of course was still there and still in much in people's mind. But as I looked at the decoration of it, I thought, no, I don't think this is Tessiphon. I think this is really somehow a kind of echo, memory, you know, calling to mind. I mean, I wouldn't say it's, you know, I wouldn't go so far as it's an identification, but it certainly, if you knew what Tessiphon looked like, it would have reminded you of it. And that is one place which was consistently reproduced in paintings. It somehow entered the mental universe of artists, and you have different kinds of representations of Tessiphon in different pictures in different ways. And sometimes it's just the inside, one of the sculptures. Sometimes it's sort of the cave. Sometimes there's a real. It's not a single thing, but it was somehow a monument that people were very aware of, and that there was some kind of tradition of reproducing it. Not an identical way, it's not, you know, there's sort of 5 or 6 different ways it shows up in bits and pieces, and some of them are more recognizable than others. It comes, of course, very easily in the story of Farhad and Shirin, because Farhad was identified in kind of in people's minds with the possible person who could have made it, which of course, you know, it's not our idea of the history of it, but it was a kind of explanation for the existence of that vault, which was really carved out of the living rock. So it is quite an extraordinary feat of you know, creating this space in the side of the mountain, which really, and it's on a major road that people went by. So it was something nobody ever forgot. They forgot what it was, but they didn't forget what it looked like. And so, but there are not many things like that that I'm aware of, which have a kind of visual identity so precise that when you see it, you know it. But there may be things we don't recognize. I mean, it's entirely possible that, you know, there are things lurking there that, who knows? Somebody will come along and say, oh, I know what that is. One of you maybe.
It seems to me that 2 occasions figure more prominently in these illustrations. Either the characters are feasting or fighting, Bazm and Raz.
Well,
is there a reason behind that?
But don't you think it's characteristic of Persian literature more generally? Might that not be a reason?
Yeah.
I think there is. I mean, the people who own these manuscripts, the people who made these manuscripts, must have known Persian literature at some level or another. And I think if you know Persian literature, you can't escape some of these ideas, really. So I think it must have been just a kind of common knowledge. But I mean, there may be a more sophisticated way of going at it. I certainly would be happy to have somebody come up with a better formulation than mine, which I think is rather lame. But I do think the theme itself fits so nicely with much of the literature that it doesn't jar when you see it. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. And I guess for me, first of all, I think you're right about this
symbolic markers, because I have something that's been brewing for a while, and markers of the cascade of sea is in separate stories. But a couple of ideas ago, it's true that it's hard to peg the landscape specifically, like you say with Ottoman 16th century miniatures, where you can actually walk around Kaftan's Sarai and really peg some of these spaces, or even in the Hippodrome, etc. But would it be possible to argue that the idea of introducing architectural landscapes is introduced to Timur's art? So that's one aspect of my thinking here, whereas you're not actually being able to peg it, that's what the Ottomans do more of, and the Moguls do, spinning off of their tradition. The second question is related to this idea of portraiture and the specificity of portraiture versus the sort of double, triple layered meaning in which their portraits are varied, and whether that has something to do with the importance they accorded themselves, as in the Mughals accorded themselves a great deal of importance. The Ottomans, especially late 15th, 16th century, great deal of importance. But if we look back at Timurid history, we have a history of a great deal of insecurity, a great deal of chaos, rebellions, different brothers. I always highlight this period in my history classes as an example of, say, Germany or Latin America in its downtime and produced magical realism, or Germany during the Cold War, East Berlin, some of the best artwork coming out of East Berlin. Is there an inverse relationship between good times and artistic production?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and there may be, as you say, periods in the more recent past where one can see this configuration. The difficulty for me in looking at the Timurid world through this particular prism is that insecurity was so kind of almost routine. If you look at Arabian history, the periods of tranquility are not very. I mean, there's a kind of low-level conflict between regional powers and competing officials. It's kind of in the background almost all the time, I would have thought. But now the other thing which I didn't bring in, and which really is I think you're probably heading toward, which is an important factor, and this is something which is a really different issue in a way, is that the question of how did artists learn to be artists? Where did they learn their trade? How did the tradition get transmitted from one generation to another? Because when you read about some of these cities and the insecurity of life, you don't see how there was really any, how it was happening that people were having time to sit down and spend, 3 months making a picture. So I think here the other ingredient, which I didn't bring in, which is a critical one, is that in the Timurid period and beyond, this artistic production is probably located in courts. It's not in cities. It's in the court. And it's in the confines of the court, in the physical confines of the court, so that these people who are painters and calligraphers are probably moving with the court as it moves, and being with the court. So in that respect, even though there was a chaotic landscape overall, there could have been a kind of nucleus of stability which permitted people to carry out these very painstaking kinds of artistic work, where it really takes, I mean, the paintings are done with great, it's a very slow kind of deliberate sort of picture making. It's not something you dash off in an afternoon. And so I think that the court framework was something that offered a sort of stability, or offered an environment which was at least less chaotic and where people got paid, or their livelihood was in some fashion secure, so that and I think the court environment really helped to promote the arts in certain ways by giving, by providing a place where people could learn the skills that they needed, transmit the skills to the next generation, and so forth. And so it wasn't really in the cities anymore, but in the court. And those courts were probably not chaotic quite to the level of some of the other aspects of the environment. I mean, I'm just speculating, but I think that might be.
Can I also follow on to that? Which is when you look at, and compare that, and now you sort of combine the two with Timurid and Safavid, there is sort of a difference that comes in terms of the landscape, in terms of the kinds of portraiture that is sort of moving away from the multiplicity of people. I'm just saying, the landscape seems to open out in Safavid.
Well, I mean, the artistic idiom keeps changing. It's not static, and I think that's one of the things which is so interesting about the visual world in the Iranian environment, is that it's much more open to change and reflective of outside connections. I mean, we see relationships in the visual world, which are harder to find, I think, in literature at the same moment, because I think the visual was not regulated, it was not prescribed, it was not controlled. And so people responded to what they saw around them. And that's a different kind of issue, but it can be more reflective of diversity, if you will, perhaps, because people had exposure to things, so that you get, I was going to perhaps mention Muhammad Zaman, you get this kind of, in the 17th century, you get Dutch prints and Flemish prints obviously being seen and being used in an artistic way long before European kind of issues occur in some other sorts of parts of the society.
Do you think that precluding that the 16th century and the mobile influence?
Well, I mean, I think painters were copying whatever. They were trained to copy. They were able to copy. And I think, if you find it, it's there. I mean, I think I don't think it's structured and controlled. I think it's a kind of open architecture, and what came to hand came to hand. I mean, that's just my feeling. Yes. But yes, me.
Yes, I had a follow-up question on the theme of the changing sensibility and artistic idiom. You end your lecture in the 17th century, even though I think you didn't show anything from the 17th century.
I was going to, but I didn't get to it.
But there must be a reason, and I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on that and get your response to it. Because I do think that in the 17th century, we do get a rather different type of portraiture. I mean, we don't get the portraiture in the Safavid arena that exists in Ottoman and Mughal sphere, which is related, yet a different topic, of course. But, the Shahs that are portrayed in one way or another, and my knowledge is fairly limited, do come across, to me at least, as completely different figures from the ones you've shown in this lecture. Three come to my mind. One is Shah Abbas I and Shah Abbas II, both of whom are situated in the setting of feasting, the Chad Sutun series. And they're very concrete, and they're not ethereal, as far as I can tell. They're very explicit somehow. And then there's a portrait of Shah Suleiman receiving foreign ambassadors. You know the one, I think it's in St. Petersburg, right? It's very lively, you have these three clearly European, Dutch or English, with their hats and all that. Again, it's the same thing, it's a world away from this kind of sensibility. And then there is one of Shah Sultan Hussein, which is also it's extraordinary, because it's wan, very sort of pale, ghostly, I think is one of the captions in one of the publications. And again, it's the Shah with his, surrounded by his courtiers. And again, it's very explicit and it's very, it's not ethereal at all, it's very concrete. So is this just European influence, or is there something else that's going on here, too, as far as you can tell us?
Well, I think it's hard to kind of tease out the process. I mean, you see the product, you see what it looks like, and you react to it. You have it reminds you of things. It suggests to you the kinds of things that conceivably someone saw who made it, or knew who made it, or the approach they took. So I think that's a reality that you have. I think that picture making was really quite flexible, and when a new environment arose and new stimuli appeared, there wasn't a problem about responding to it. So the question is to sort of go from those, from the result, and say, all right, what might have stimulated them to do this, and to look for some kind of connecting link between what you see and what they may have seen. But of course, one is in the realm of speculation because one doesn't really, I think it's reconstructible to a degree, at least in hypothetical terms, the kind of visual materials that they had access to. And that's the thing which changes all the time. And so each period has its own set of stimuli. Each period has its own materials that it has access to. And you can morph from one to the other without any real, difficulty. Because there was no impediment. If the artist felt like using a Dutch print as the basis of a landscape, then why not? There was no intrinsic reason. If he had access, he could use it. So it wasn't a philosophical question, I don't think, so much as what was really there for people to use. And that would be in my thinking sort of another dimension of the reality around the picture-making environment, which maybe the pictures tell us what the reality was in a way that we couldn't otherwise know. And so I think the thing about the visual is that it changes. And it isn't constrained by the past. And it's also, I thought of trying to bring in more examples where you have some kind of really concrete reference to something, a place or an event or something. There aren't a lot of these, but every once in a while you stumble on one and you think, well, okay, that's what they were trying to do. But you have to kind of find it. It doesn't tell you of its own accord what it is. But for example, the Muhammad Zaman pictures, I think there's a lot that could be done with them about what was he seeing, what kinds of visual material did he have at his disposal, because they're very precise and they're very clear, and there's something out there. I mean, whether it's Italianate style prints from Holland or whatever it is. I mean, people have done much more with what the Mughals were dealing with. There's an amount of energy invested in what the Mughals had and saw and knew is multiple of what's been done with Iran. But I don't see why it should be different, And much is made of Akbar saying this or Jahangir saying that because we know about it. And because it's all very easy to get to. But I don't see why it couldn't have happened in Iran just as well. And, you know, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. If you find it, it's there, it seems to me. You know, but it just takes someone putting the effort into it. First of all, collecting the examples, putting the effort into it, and saying, what is this telling us? And, you know, I'm sure there's a lot more to be discovered. I'm certain of it. And it goes on. I mean, it goes on into the Qajar period, of course, too, where this engagement with other kinds, other environments is sort of going on in the background. And, you know, you find it visually. There's no kind of technical reason not to have it there. You see, I mean, something brand new that, oh, that's really interesting. Why don't we put it in? So I think the visual is an open, has an open architecture in a way that some things do not, probably. But that's not my field, so I'm not going to comment on the negative. Yes.
No, I was intrigued by your suggestion that there's, during times of rebellion, that people would try to associate, would want to associate themselves with the hero, try in a way to bolster their legitimacy. So there's a subtext there that you're saying, that they're saying that I am really legitimate, I may be under siege or under threat, and I'm wondering who would be the audience for that?
Probably self-referential.
Is it more that than?
I mean, where we can see it is in books that we know belong to somebody. So, I mean, it was perhaps, you know, a kind of, but it also may be that the artists at the court, you know, introduced it as a kind of compliment. You know, I mean, we don't, see, here you're getting into the area of causation, motivation, execution, which requires a kind of knowledge of who did what to whom, which we're never going to have, I don't think. I mean, barring some extraordinary stroke of luck, one's dealing here with a kind of environment in which one has to deal with these individuals in a fairly generic fashion, because they're not really knowable on a personal level at that point.
Do you know much about the audience for these other than the individual that came from?
Well, I mean, books were valuable, and they were kept in a safe place. I think there was, you know, no lending library, there was no internet, etc. I mean, no Xerox machines. You know, the opportunities for seeing something outside your immediate environment were probably much more limited. So I think it reflects the person's, you know, own knowledge, but getting to the level of the person who is the actor is very difficult.
Well, if there are no more questions, please help yourselves to the reception. And would our friends please set up a circle of chairs for students afterwards who may wish to talk to Dr. Soucek? Would you be staying on it?